The old town of Greenbrook, nestled in the heart of Pennsylvania, had always been quiet, peaceful, a place where the locals prided themselves on their tight-knit community. Sunday mornings were especially sacred as the whole town gathered at the massive First Church of Greenbrook, where Pastor Daniel Harris preached. His was a life of unwavering faith, guiding his congregation with wisdom, kindness, and a strong moral compass. At least that's what everyone believed. But beneath the pious exterior, Pastor Daniel was a man with secrets. Secrets only his daughter, 18-year-old Naomi Harris, truly understood. Naomi had been born into this world of faith and tradition. She was the product of a marriage that seemed perfect, or at least that's how it appeared to the public eye. Her mother, Alice Harris, had been the epitome of grace. She was the kind of woman who knew how to smile even in the darkest times, the type who stood by her husband's side through thick and thin. Naomi grew up in this world, sheltered from the complexities of life outside the church walls. However, her perfect world shattered when she was just 16. It was the day her mother, Alice, died suddenly. Naomi's world was turned upside down. She had been told that her mother had fallen ill with a rare disease that no one could identify. The doctors were baffled, and despite the efforts of the local hospital, Alice died within a matter of weeks. The town mourned, and Pastor Daniel preached a heartfelt sermon at the funeral, but Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her mother's death felt too sudden, too unnatural. For 2 years, Naomi buried her questions, trying to carry on with her life. Though it was hard, she began to notice how her father had changed. The once warm and compassionate pastor seemed distant, cold even. Naomi knew there were moments when he would disappear for long periods of time, coming back with his clothes disheveled, his eyes hollow. She didn't question it at first, assuming he was simply grieving in his own way. But deep down, Naomi felt that there was more to her mother's death than anyone was willing to admit. It wasn't until a few months ago, when Naomi found an old forgotten envelope hidden in her father's study, that the truth began to unravel. The envelope was addressed to her mother and contained a letter written by a local clinic, an anonymous letter suggesting that Alice had been diagnosed with HIV, a virus that would be fatal without treatment. The letter was dated just days before her mother's sudden illness. Naomi's heart sank as she read the words. There was no mention of this diagnosis during the funeral, and she had never been told. It was then that she started putting the pieces together. Naomi's suspicions grew into anger. She knew her father had been hiding something, but what hurt the most was that her mother had been deceived by the man she had trusted more than anyone. Pastor Daniel, her father, had likely infected her mother with the virus. And now Naomi was left with the bitter truth that her mother's death was no accident. It was the consequence of betrayal. But Naomi wasn't ready to confront her father just yet. She needed to think. She needed to plan. She wasn't sure how to approach him, but one thing was clear. She wanted him to feel the same pain, the same helplessness that had consumed her when she lost her mother. There was only one way to do that: revenge. As the days went by, Naomi grew more determined. She studied everything she could about HIV, how it spread, and how to infect someone without them knowing. She was careful, meticulous, and soon she had a plan. Her father, though devout in his faith, had made one fatal mistake. He trusted his daughter, and Naomi was prepared to use that trust to destroy him, just as he had destroyed her mother. The plan was simple: infect her father with the very same virus that had killed Alice. Slowly, deliberately. And she would watch as the man who had betrayed her mother suffered the same fate. Naomi wasn't the sweet, innocent daughter everyone thought she was. The truth was, she had inherited more from her mother than just her looks. She had inherited her quiet strength, her patience, and a mind that could calculate every move with surgical precision. And as she stood in front of her father's church, watching him preach to his congregation, Naomi knew that her revenge had just begun. Detective Sarah Mitchell had seen a lot of things in her years on the job: homicides, disappearances, and cases of betrayal that would leave even the most hardened officers shaken. But when she was assigned to the case of Pastor Daniel Harris, she could feel that there was something different about this one. It all started with a phone call. It was the local coroner's office in Greenbrook. Pastor Daniel had been found dead in his home, his body discovered by Naomi Harris, his daughter. The official cause of death was initially listed as heart failure, a condition that had plagued the pastor for years. But there was something about the scene that didn't sit right with Detective Mitchell. Naomi's behavior was peculiar, too calm, almost rehearsed, and there was no sign of any struggle or illness that would explain the sudden death. As soon as Mitchell stepped into the Harris household, she could feel the tension in the air. Naomi sat silently in the living room, her eyes red from crying, though there were no signs of any real distress. The house was immaculate, everything in its place, as if nothing had ever been amiss. But the more Mitchell looked around, the more she could sense the darkness that lingered beneath the surface. The first thing Mitchell did was examine the body. Pastor Daniel's death, while seemingly natural, had some unusual signs. His veins appeared to be unusually swollen, his skin showing signs of bruising that suggested an infection of some kind. It wasn't immediately clear what had caused these symptoms, but Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than a simple heart attack. The detective turned her attention to the family's medical records, starting with Pastor Daniels. She knew that in a small town like Greenbrook, the pastor's life was an open book to everyone who cared to look. She was able to obtain a copy of his recent health history, which included a long-standing battle with hypertension and a recent diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. But buried beneath those records was something more troubling, evidence of a past HIV diagnosis. It wasn't confirmed, but the doctor's notes suggested that Daniel had been treated for a long-term condition that involved HIV medication. The implications were shocking. If Daniel had been living with the virus, it raised questions about his relationship with his wife Alice. Had he infected her? And if so, had it played a role in her death? As Mitchell dug deeper into the case, she uncovered another chilling fact. Naomi had been diagnosed with HIV as well. The dots were starting to connect. It was clear that there had been a secret, a deadly secret, buried in the Harris family. But Mitchell needed more evidence before she could make any conclusions. The truth was hiding, and she was determined to find it. Over the next few weeks, Detective Mitchell interviewed everyone who had come into contact with the Harris family, including the church congregation and the local medical professionals. Her suspicions grew stronger, and she began to piece together a narrative that led her to one shocking conclusion. Naomi had a motive, but there was one question that still haunted Mitchell. How far would Naomi go to seek revenge? And could she prove it before it was too late? The days following Pastor Daniel Harris's death were a blur of confusion and conflicting emotions for Naomi. To the outside world, she was a grieving daughter, heartbroken over the sudden loss of her father. But within her, a storm raged, a mix of relief, anger, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing her father pay for his betrayal. His death was the culmination of 2 years of planning, of carefully constructing a web of deceit. But now, as Detective Sarah Mitchell's investigation closed in on her, Naomi realized she had underestimated how deeply the truth ran. Detective Mitchell wasn't one to be swayed by appearances. She had spent enough years in law enforcement to know when something didn't add up. Naomi's calm demeanor during the investigation made Mitchell suspicious, and as the days passed, she began to find pieces of the puzzle that painted a more sinister picture. Naomi had been the perfect daughter, always attending church with her father, supporting him through every sermon. But Mitchell had a hunch that there was more to Naomi's story than the perfect little girl she presented to the world. Naomi was intelligent, calculating, and the detective had uncovered something startling. Naomi had tested positive for HIV. The more Mitchell thought about it, the clearer it became. Naomi's mother, Alice, had died suddenly, and her father, the pastor, had been diagnosed with HIV around the same time. The medical records suggested that Alice had contracted the virus just before her death, which meant it had to have come from Daniel. But what Mitchell couldn't understand was why Naomi would be infected as well. She could see the father-daughter relationship from the outside, strong, loving, and respectful. Naomi would never have been exposed to such a dangerous virus unless it was deliberate, and that's when it hit her. Naomi had a motive. Mitchell turned to the church records next, searching for anything that might reveal more about Naomi's past. She spoke with members of the congregation, hoping someone might have noticed a change in Naomi's behavior or interactions with her father. Most of the churchgoers described her as quiet but kind, someone who blended into the background. No one had noticed anything unusual about her, except for the fact that she had started spending more time away from her father after Alice's death. When Mitchell pressed Naomi further, she noticed a shift in the young woman's demeanor. Naomi had been cooperative at first, but as the questions grew more pointed, she became defensive. She seemed to hesitate whenever Mitchell asked about her mother's sudden death or her father's health. The detective was convinced that Naomi knew more than she was letting on. But what could she possibly gain from her father's death? And how could she have orchestrated such a cunning scheme to make it look like a natural death? Mitchell's next move was to look into the details of Alice's illness. Naomi had told her that her mother had been diagnosed with an unknown disease before she passed away. But the detective wasn't satisfied with that explanation. She ordered an autopsy on Alice's body, hoping it would reveal more about the cause of her death. The results came back within a week, confirming that Alice had indeed been infected with HIV. What's more, the autopsy showed traces of the virus in her bloodstream for months before her death. The virus had spread, slowly undetected, until it was too late. This revelation sent a shiver down Mitchell's spine. Naomi's mother had been infected well before her death, meaning the infection had to have come from someone she trusted. Pastor Daniel, the man who had vowed to protect his family, was the one who had infected Alice. But now Mitchell had to ask herself, did Naomi know about it? And if so, had she orchestrated her father's death in retaliation? Mitchell's thoughts were interrupted by a call from the coroner's office. The final autopsy report on Pastor Daniel had been completed. The results were shocking. His death had been caused by acute complications related to HIV, a form of the virus that attacks the immune system, leaving the body defenseless against infections. It wasn't a heart attack as originally suspected. Pastor Daniel had died from complications of the very virus that had killed his wife. But there was something even more unusual about the way he had contracted the virus. The coroner's report revealed that Pastor Daniel had been living with HIV for years, far longer than anyone had realized. His medical records indicated that he had been diagnosed in his early 40s, long before his wife's death. The most telling part, however, was the presence of a secondary infection in his body. The virus had been dormant for years, but it had suddenly flared up, much like an infection from an untreated wound. The revelation was damning. Pastor Daniel had been carrying the virus for years, but it wasn't until after Alice's death that the disease became fatal. This was no accident, it was murder. And Naomi, who had tested positive for HIV herself, now became the prime suspect in a case that had already taken a dark and unexpected turn. Mitchell's suspicions were confirmed when she re-examined Naomi's recent medical records. Naomi had been treated for an STD just a month before her father's death, an STD that was linked to HIV transmission. The pieces were finally falling into place. Naomi had been infected with the virus by her father, perhaps even intentionally. The betrayal ran so deep that Naomi had taken matters into her own hands, seeking revenge for the death of her mother. It was clear now, Naomi's motive wasn't just grief, it was rage. The silence in the interrogation room was almost suffocating as Detective Sarah Mitchell leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Naomi. The young woman's hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white with tension. It was as though Naomi were caught in an emotional vice, torn between the guilt of her actions and the bitterness of her revenge. The confession had been agonizingly close, and Mitchell could see that Naomi was on the edge of breaking completely. Naomi sat there, her head down, avoiding Mitchell's gaze. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. I didn't want him to die. I wanted him to suffer. I wanted him to know what he did to my mother. She looked up at Mitchell, her face a mask of sorrow and resentment. I wanted him to feel the way I felt when she died, but I couldn't tell anyone the truth, not even you. Mitchell was silent for a moment, letting Naomi's words hang in the air. This wasn't the confession she had expected, but it was the one she had hoped to hear. Naomi had been slowly coming apart at the seams, and now the cracks were wide enough for the truth to pour through. You know, Naomi, Mitchell said gently, this is more than just about revenge. This is about a betrayal of trust that cuts deep, more than you probably even realized. Your father betrayed your mother, and you felt betrayed too. But there's no redemption in what you did. Naomi let out a soft sob, shaking her head. I didn't know what else to do. All I wanted was for him to hurt the way we did. He took her from us. He killed her. With his lies, his secrets. And I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I watched him suffer, yes, but it was nothing compared to the way we suffered when she was gone. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted him to feel it. Mitchell's heart softened, but her resolve remained firm. Revenge doesn't bring peace, Naomi. It only chains you to the past. What happened between your parents isn't something you could fix by causing him pain. You didn't deserve to be hurt like that, but taking matters into your own hands, it's not the way to heal. Naomi wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to compose herself. I know. I know it wasn't the right thing to do, but I was so angry. He lied to me. He lied to everyone, and he didn't care what he was doing to us, to my mother, to me. He just kept preaching and pretending like everything was fine. Did you ever confront him? Mitchell asked softly. Naomi shook her head. I tried once, after the funeral. I asked him about her death, about the letter I found, but he just told me I was overthinking it. He said it was just a mistake, that we couldn't blame him. He acted like it didn't matter. Naomi's voice trembled. But it did. It mattered. I couldn't forgive him for that. Mitchell sat back in her chair, studying Naomi carefully. You didn't just want him to suffer, did you? You wanted him to understand. You wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done, and not just to your mother. You wanted him to see what kind of man he really was. But you didn't just expose him. You punished him in the worst possible way. Naomi's eyes locked with the detective's. I didn't think about it like that. I only thought about getting revenge, making him pay. But now I realize I destroyed everything. I destroyed him. I destroyed myself. The pain in Naomi's voice was unmistakable. Mitchell had seen this kind of remorse before, but the cost had been incredibly high. Naomi wasn't just a young girl who'd snapped under pressure. She was a person who had made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Naomi, Mitchell began, her voice gentle but firm, what you did was murder. There's no way around that. Your father didn't die because of an illness. He died because you gave him the virus. You made sure it would take him slowly. You watched as it consumed him, just as it had your mother. You played God with his life. Naomi stared at the floor, her body shaking with silent sobs. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't live with the pain anymore. I couldn't live with the secret. I just wanted it to end. I wanted him to face the truth. But now I see. Now you see, Mitchell pressed, leaning in slightly. Now you see that nothing you do can undo the hurt. Nothing can take back the choices you made. Your mother's death was tragic enough, and it should have been the catalyst for your healing, not more pain. Naomi's face was streaked with tears, but her voice grew stronger as she spoke. I didn't know how to make it right. I didn't know how to forgive him. I thought I would feel better once he was gone, but I don't. I don't feel better. I feel empty. I feel like I've lost everything. Mitchell's tone softened. You have to live with what you did, Naomi. But it doesn't have to define you. There is still a way forward, but it's going to take time and real effort. If you want redemption, it's going to take more than just confessing. It's going to take accepting responsibility and facing the consequences of your actions. For the first time during the interview, Naomi looked up at Mitchell with a look of clarity, pain mixed with acceptance. I understand. I know what I've done. I know that I'll never get my mother back. I'll never make things right with my father. But maybe I can start by accepting the truth and facing what's to come. Mitchell sat back in her chair, watching Naomi as she struggled with the weight of her confession. She could tell that Naomi wasn't fully at peace with her decision yet, but she was beginning to come to terms with the fact that there were no easy answers, no shortcuts to healing. Naomi, Mitchell said softly, you're going to have to face the law, and that's part of the process, but there's still a long road ahead for you. It's not about what's been done, but what you do next that matters. Naomi nodded slowly, her face set with a mix of sorrow and resolve. I know. I just wish I could undo it all. Mitchell's voice softened even further, the weight of the case pressing on her as well. I know, but all you can do now is move forward, one step at a time. As Naomi sat there in the interrogation room, facing the consequences of her actions, Mitchell couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for the young woman. She had lost her mother, her father, and, in many ways, her own innocence. But at least now, she was no longer hiding from the truth. It was a start, albeit a painful one. Mitchell rose from her chair, signaling the end of the interview. I'll make sure you have everything you need, Naomi, but you'll need to prepare yourself for what comes next. Naomi remained seated, her gaze distant as the detective left the room. Her path forward would be difficult, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a glimmer of hope left for someone who had felt so lost for so long. The weeks following Naomi's confession were a blur of legal procedures, press conferences, and mounting tension. The case of Pastor Daniel Harris's death had shocked the small town of Willow Creek, and the revelation of his daughter's involvement had shaken the tight-knit community to its core. Naomi had confessed to intentionally infecting her father with HIV, causing his slow, painful death. The act of revenge, though driven by years of hidden pain and rage, had irrevocably altered the lives of everyone involved. Detective Mitchell had been present during Naomi's initial confession, but now she found herself stepping back into the role of observer. The case had shifted from investigation to legal action. Naomi, who had once been the quiet, obedient daughter, was now sitting at the center of a criminal trial that would determine her fate. The courtroom was packed the day Naomi's trial began. The air was thick with anticipation as reporters and spectators filled the seats, eager to see justice served. Naomi, looking smaller and more fragile than she had in months, sat beside her attorney, her eyes cast downward, avoiding the stares of the crowd. Her once immaculate appearance had given way to the rawness of grief, regret, and uncertainty. She wore an expression that seemed to say, I've already lost everything. Detective Mitchell was sitting in the back of the courtroom, her arms folded, her face neutral. She had done her job. She had uncovered the truth. But now, watching the young woman face the consequences of her actions, Mitchell felt a complex mix of emotions: sympathy for Naomi's pain, but also an undeniable sense of duty to see justice done. The prosecution was quick to build its case, focusing on the deliberate nature of Naomi's actions. The evidence was undeniable. Naomi had known exactly what she was doing when she infected her father with HIV. She had planned it, had waited for the right moment, and had watched as the virus slowly weakened him. The prosecution painted a portrait of a young woman consumed by vengeance, driven by a need to punish her father for the death of her mother and the betrayal she had suffered at his hands. As the prosecutor presented the details of the case, Mitchell couldn't help but feel the weight of Naomi's choices. The prosecution described how Naomi had tampered with her father's medication, contaminated it with the virus, and waited. They described the months of deterioration, the slow, agonizing process that had led to Pastor Daniel's death. The prosecution argued that Naomi had acted out of spite, with premeditated malice. In her defense, Naomi's attorney presented a different narrative. He painted her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a traumatized daughter, a victim of emotional abuse and neglect. The attorney argued that Naomi had been manipulated by her father's lies and that she had suffered deeply from the loss of her mother. The defense team called upon Naomi's history, presenting her as a young woman who had always been a loyal daughter, but one who had been deeply scarred by her father's actions. Naomi's lawyer claimed that her actions were born of desperation and heartbreak, not calculated malice. The attorney explained that Naomi had felt utterly alone, abandoned by her father's betrayal and her mother's death. Her sense of justice had become twisted, and her decision to take matters into her own hands was an act of a young woman who had lost all sense of direction. Mitchell had expected the defense to argue something along those lines. She had seen many cases where trauma clouded judgment, where emotional pain led to irrational actions. Naomi's story wasn't new. It was tragic, but it wasn't unique. Many people in their grief had done things they later regretted. As the trial continued, Naomi remained silent, her eyes never leaving her hands, which she wrung together nervously in her lap. She was a shell of the confident, intelligent young woman who had once seemed so unshakable. Now all she could do was sit there, absorbing the weight of the accusations, the guilt, and the grief. Detective Mitchell had spent hours reviewing the case before the trial. She knew the depths of Naomi's anguish, and she knew that her actions had been born out of a desire to make sense of her pain. But the fact remained. Naomi had murdered her father. She had caused his death in the most cruel and calculated way, regardless of the emotional trauma that had driven her. There were no easy answers in this case. The law had a simple, clear rule. If you take someone's life, you must answer for it. But Detective Mitchell knew that the emotional complexities surrounding this case would make the outcome much more difficult to predict. Naomi's life had been shattered, and the jury would need to decide whether or not her actions were justifiable, whether her grief and pain could excuse the murder of her father. The trial had stretched on for days, with both sides presenting their arguments. The defense had painted a portrait of a deeply troubled young woman who had been driven to the edge by loss, while the prosecution had argued that Naomi's premeditated actions amounted to murder. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned to the courtroom, the tension in the air was palpable. Naomi sat in the defendant's chair, her hands trembling in her lap. Detective Mitchell, watching from the back of the room, could see the fear in Naomi's eyes. The young woman knew what was coming. There was no way to predict the jury's decision, but Naomi's future was hanging in the balance. The judge called the room to order, and the foreman of the jury stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Naomi Harris, guilty of second-degree murder. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Naomi's face went pale, and for a moment it looked as if she might faint. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but Naomi didn't react. She was too numb, too distant to feel anything except the crushing weight of her fate. The judge instructed Naomi to stand as the sentencing was prepared. There was no going back now. She would be sentenced for the death of her father. Detective Mitchell felt a pang of sadness. In the end, this case wasn't just about the murder of Pastor Daniel Harris. It was about the devastating effects of unchecked grief, of the dangerous power of revenge when it is allowed to fester unchecked. Naomi had destroyed the very things she had been trying to protect, her family. The gavel struck with a sharp, echoing thud, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge, a seasoned man in his late 60s, looked down at the papers in front of him, his eyes briefly flickering to Naomi before he spoke. The air felt dense, heavy with anticipation. Naomi sat motionless in the defendant's chair, her shoulders slumped, her hands clasped tightly together. For a moment it seemed as if the weight of the room was pressing down on her, suffocating her. Naomi Harris, the judge began, his voice firm but not without compassion. You stand here today not as a victim, but as a perpetrator of a crime that has cost your father his life. I understand the depth of your grief, the pain of losing your mother, and the betrayal you felt at your father's hands. But while this court recognizes the emotional torment that led to your actions, we must not forget that murder, regardless of the emotional scars that drive it, is still murder. The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. Her head lowered further, her eyes fixed on the floor. But the sting of the truth was undeniable. She had thought, perhaps foolishly, that the justice system would show mercy, that the years of pain she had carried would somehow weigh in her favor. But the law was cold, indifferent to the motives behind the crime. It cared only about the actions themselves, and Naomi knew, deep down, that she had no excuse for what she had done. The crime you committed, the judge continued, was deliberate, calculated, and carried out over a prolonged period of time. Your father, Pastor Daniel Harris, suffered and ultimately died as a result of your actions. The court finds it impossible to ignore the extent of the pain he endured, nor the damage you have inflicted upon your own family. Naomi blinked, the tears brimming in her eyes, threatening to spill over once more. But she refused to look up. She had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the finality of it. The realization that she would never be free from the consequences of her choices. Naomi Harris, you are hereby sentenced to serve a minimum of 15 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after that time, depending on your conduct and rehabilitation. The judge's voice was final, and his gaze held an unspoken message. There was no room for leniency in this case. The sentence was delivered, and the room seemed to exhale collectively. For a moment there was silence, an eerie stillness that hung in the air. Naomi didn't react, not immediately. The reality of her situation was slowly sinking in. 15 years. It might as well have been a lifetime. Her attorney, who had been sitting beside her, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but Naomi barely felt it. She had already withdrawn into herself, her thoughts a maelstrom of regret and grief. What had started as an act of vengeance had turned into something far worse, a loss that could never be undone. As the courtroom began to empty, Detective Mitchell stood from her seat at the back of the room. She had been there throughout the trial, watching Naomi's transformation from a confident, determined young woman to a broken and remorseful soul. Mitchell had seen the darkness in Naomi's eyes, but she had also seen the flickers of recognition, the understanding that her actions had been a mistake, that there was no going back. Mitchell walked toward the exit, her mind racing. She had always believed in justice, in the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. But as she looked back at Naomi, sitting there in her chair, a young woman so full of potential, now locked in the prison of her own making, she couldn't help but feel a deep, unsettling sadness. Naomi's pain had led to the death of her father, but in the end, it was also Naomi who would suffer most. The prison gates clanged shut behind Naomi with a deafening sound, marking the official end of her old life. The familiar world outside, the memories of her mother's death, her father's betrayal, her desire for revenge, all of it was left behind as she stepped into the cold, sterile environment of the state penitentiary. Naomi's mind had wandered constantly in the days following her sentencing. She had spent hours staring at the walls of her cell, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She had hoped in the darkest corners of her mind that somehow she could wake up from this nightmare. But reality was cruel. She was here now, and there was no escaping it. Prison was nothing like the church or the home she had once known. The cold, harsh metal of the bars, the constant hum of fluorescent lights above, the murmur of voices in the distance. It was a world that felt like it belonged to someone else, a world she never imagined she would be a part of. Naomi had no illusions about her future. She knew that her time in prison would be long, that every day would be a reminder of what she had done. But she also knew that this was her chance, however small, to rebuild, to find a way to atone for her actions. And maybe, just maybe, find a way to forgive herself. Her first few weeks in prison were the hardest. Naomi kept to herself, not speaking much to the other inmates. She was still processing the weight of her sentence, the trauma of her past, and the overwhelming sense of loss that seemed to define her existence. She missed her mother, her old life, and the innocence she had once taken for granted. She missed being seen as more than a criminal, as someone with a future. One afternoon, as Naomi sat alone in the prison yard, a woman approached her. The woman was older, with graying hair and a face that bore the marks of years spent behind bars. She looked at Naomi with a mixture of curiosity and understanding. "You okay?" the woman asked, her voice surprisingly soft. Naomi glanced up, startled. "I'm fine," she replied, though she knew the woman didn't believe her. She wasn't fine. Nothing about her was fine. The woman sat down next to Naomi, a comforting silence falling between them. "You're new here," the woman said. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it. But it's going to take time. A lot of time." Naomi nodded, her gaze falling to the ground. She didn't want to talk, but something in the woman's presence made her feel less alone. "You know," the woman continued, "I've been in here a long time, more years than I can count, and I did some things I'm not proud of, but I'm still breathing. I'm still here, and I'm learning to forgive myself. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Naomi looked up at her, surprised. "Forgive yourself?" The woman smiled faintly. "Yeah, you have to. If you don't, you'll just end up dying in here, even if you're still alive. You don't want that." Naomi let the words sink in, their weight heavy on her heart. The woman was right. If she didn't find a way to forgive herself, she would be trapped forever, locked in her own guilt, unable to move forward. The days blurred together in the cold, lonely corridors of the prison. But Naomi was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she was starting to rebuild herself. She had found solace in the prison's education program, where she studied psychology and counseling. The courses helped her process her grief, and more importantly, they gave her a purpose beyond her sentence. She began to reach out to others, offering a listening ear and finding ways to connect with the people around her. Her relationship with her mother's death had not gotten easier, but she had started to understand the complexity of her emotions, the need for revenge, the pain of betrayal. Naomi realized that it had all been part of her grieving process. She had been angry, confused, and hurt. But now, with the passage of time, she had begun to see that forgiveness was the only way forward. Forgiveness of her father, and perhaps one day, forgiveness of herself. 2 years had passed since Naomi's conviction, and life behind bars had changed her in ways she never anticipated. Her earlier resentment and anger had faded into a quiet acceptance. The days, though monotonous, no longer felt as suffocating. Her routine was simple: study, work, and reflection. Naomi had learned through countless hours spent alone with her thoughts that redemption wasn't something that could be handed to her. It was something she had to earn, step by step, day by day. The prison's rehabilitation program, which focused on education and counseling, had become Naomi's sanctuary. She had worked hard to prove herself, not only to the authorities but also to the people she had wronged, including herself. Though she couldn't undo the harm she had caused, she knew that her future depended on her willingness to confront the consequences of her actions and learn from them. Naomi had enrolled in therapy, a decision that had felt like a monumental step at the time. It wasn't easy, but the more she unpacked the trauma of her past, the loss of her mother, the betrayal of her father, and the way those wounds had driven her to commit the unthinkable, the more she began to understand the complexities of human emotion. She had been so consumed by her pain that she hadn't known how to process it properly. The therapy gave her the tools to finally face the truth without running from it. It was in one of her therapy sessions during a particularly raw conversation about guilt and forgiveness that Naomi had an epiphany. She realized that, while her father had wronged her deeply, her actions, no matter how justified they seemed at the time, had ultimately perpetuated the cycle of pain. She couldn't undo her father's death, and she couldn't change the past, but she could choose to stop the cycle of anger and regret that had ruled her life. One afternoon, after another long session in the education program, Naomi sat down at the small steel desk in her cell and pulled out a sheet of paper. Her heart raced as she held the pen in her hand. Writing this letter had been on her mind for months, but she had been hesitant, unsure of how it would be received. Now she had finally decided to take the step. She wrote the letter carefully, pouring out her thoughts, her regrets, and her heartfelt apology. Dear Pastor Daniels, I don't know where to begin. I don't know if I can ever express the pain and sorrow I feel for what I did to you. There are no words that can make up for taking your life, and I know I can't change the past. But I want you to know that I am sorry. I had been angry for so long, angry at you for your betrayal, angry at the world for taking my mother, and angry at myself for being too weak to deal with it. I felt like I had no control, no way to make the world pay for the hurt that I had endured. I thought that by taking you from this world, I would feel better, that the hole inside me would be filled. But instead, it grew larger, and I realized that there was no peace in revenge. I have learned in these long years of being away from the world that forgiveness is not for the person who wrongs you. It's for you. And though I can't ask for your forgiveness, I can't change the terrible thing I did. I can forgive myself. I can forgive myself because I want to move forward. I want to make amends, if not to you, then to the people I can still impact. I can never bring you back. I can never undo the damage I've done, but I can make sure that your death wasn't for nothing. I can change, and I hope somehow that in the afterlife you will find peace and that you will know how deeply sorry I am. Yours in sorrow, Naomi Harris. When Naomi finished the letter, she sat back, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the page. This wasn't just a letter. It was an offering of peace, a tangible attempt at redemption. Naomi sealed the envelope with a heavy heart, unsure if it would ever reach anyone who could make sense of her apology. Pastor Daniels was gone, and though she doubted his family or the church would forgive her, She needed to express what had been sitting so painfully inside her for years. She handed the letter to the prison's counselor, asking if it could be delivered to his surviving family members, or at least to his church. The counselor nodded, understanding the gravity of what Naomi was asking. "I'll make sure it reaches them, Naomi," he said gently. "It might not change everything, but it's a step. You're making peace with yourself." For the first time in years, Naomi felt the faintest trace of hope. It was not about the outside world forgiving her. It was about healing the wounds inside her that had festered for so long. And for the first time, she felt like she might finally be able to let go. The parole hearing. Months passed, and Naomi's transformation did not go unnoticed. The prison staff had seen how much effort she had put into her rehabilitation, how committed she was to making things right. She had completed her degree in counseling, and she volunteered to work with other inmates, helping them navigate their own trauma. Her behavior had been exemplary, and she had shown sincere remorse for her crime. It was during one of her parole hearings that Naomi was confronted with a decision that could change her life forever. The hearing took place in a sterile room with a panel of judges who would decide whether or not Naomi deserved an early release. As the panel questioned her, Naomi spoke openly about the work she had done to transform herself. She acknowledged the wrongness of her actions and the grief that had led her down such a destructive path. But she also spoke of her desire to contribute to the world, to use the lessons she had learned in prison to help others. The panel members listened intently, their expressions unreadable. Naomi had heard rumors of others who had been denied parole despite their efforts. It was possible that they would not grant her release, that she would have to remain in prison for the full 15 years. But Naomi had done everything she could to show that she had changed. She had paid her dues. As the hearing came to an end, the panel gave no immediate decision. But the moment Naomi stepped outside the room, a guard handed her a piece of paper. It was the decision: parole granted, effective immediately. Tears filled Naomi's eyes, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something other than sorrow. She wasn't free from her past. That would always be with her. But she was free to start over. She was free to take the lessons of her time in prison and use them to make a difference in the world. Naomi left the prison that day, her steps tentative but full of purpose. She knew there would be challenges ahead. Rebuilding her life outside of the prison walls wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, she had hope. Hope that redemption was possible, even for someone who had done the unthinkable. Naomi's life after prison was far from simple. She returned to Willow Creek, a place that held both the memory of her mother and the grave of her father. But instead of returning as the broken daughter who had destroyed her father's life, Naomi came back as someone who had learned the hard way that forgiveness and redemption were the true paths to healing. She became a counselor, working with young people who, like her, had been consumed by anger and pain. Naomi didn't seek forgiveness from the outside world. Instead, she focused on changing herself, on proving that she could learn from her mistakes, help others, and perhaps, in time, heal her fractured soul. Naomi Harris had taken a life, but in doing so, she had also found the power to give a new one to herself. And for that, she was finally at peace.